Amidst the raging protests, Officer Michael Roberts found himself standing alone in the center of a storm of anger and hostility. The once bustling streets of Washington, D.C. had become a battleground, the air thick with frustration and rage. The protesters, their faces contorted in fury, hurled racial slurs and hateful chants at him, their words like daggers aimed directly at his soul. For an hour, Officer Roberts had endured their relentless assault, each insult more painful than the last. His years of service had prepared him for confrontations with criminals and even volatile situations, but this was different. This wasn't a typical standoff between law enforcement and the public. It was deeply personal. It was about his very identity, his character, and the injustice he felt in his bones. As a black officer, he had always known that his job came with certain risks, but standing in this sea of hostile faces, the weight of those risks had never felt so heavy. This wasn't just anger directed at the system, at policies, or even at law enforcement. It was anger directed at him, and him alone. The crowd wasn't upset about an incident or a political issue. They were angry at him for the color of his skin. His uniform, his badge, his identity, all of it became a symbol of everything they despised. The verbal onslaught was constant. "Uncle Tom," they yelled, "sell out! You're just as bad as the rest." The slurs felt like physical blows, each one landing with unrelenting force, reminding Officer Roberts that in their eyes, he wasn't a man doing his job. He was a traitor to his race. But despite it all, he stood firm. His jaw clenched, his fists at his sides, he refused to flinch. He couldn't show weakness, not now, not in front of them. Yet inside, something was cracking. The strength that had always been his anchor was wavering. The hateful words seemed to drown out everything else, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered how much longer he could hold on. As the hatred continued to flow toward him, the crowd's anger intensifying with each passing second, something extraordinary happened. The distant hum of a helicopter began to rise above the noise, cutting through the thick tension in the air. It was louder than any of the protesters' chants, a sharp sound that demanded attention. The protesters fell silent for a brief moment, some looking up in confusion, others in anticipation. The sound wasn't just that of a helicopter. It was the sound of something larger, something that promised change. The roar of the helicopter grew louder, and the crowd's collective breath seemed to be held in suspense. Then, the unmistakable silhouette of a figure emerged from the shadow of the aircraft. From behind the chopper's rotating blades, none other than former President Donald Trump appeared, stepping onto the ground with the same bold, unshakable presence he had always embodied. The crowd, still reeling from the intensity of the protest just moments before, now stood frozen in disbelief. Trump's arrival had done what nothing else could, brought the chaos to an abrupt halt. The protesters, once screaming in fury, now found themselves staring, unsure of what to make of this unexpected twist in the drama. It was as if the very air around them had shifted, and for the first time in hours, the energy in the street changed. Trump's appearance wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a statement. His every step seemed purposeful, his tall figure cutting through the crowd with the confidence that had become his trademark. As he moved forward, his eyes fixed on Officer Roberts, who had yet to move, still standing in the midst of a storm of racial hate. Despite the hostile atmosphere, Trump's gaze remained unwavering, his expression resolute. His presence in the middle of this fury was a force unto itself, and even the most vocal of protesters could not help but be stilled by it. For a moment, there was only silence, an unnatural quiet that blanketed the street. Then, as if guided by an invisible hand, Trump raised his arm and pointed to Officer Roberts. The crowd, still unsure how to respond, instinctively fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath as the former president's voice broke through the stillness. "This man," Trump began, his voice carrying across the street with undeniable authority, is a hero. He is here to protect you, to protect this city. And you will not degrade him based on the color of his skin. This is not who we are. We stand for justice, for unity, and for the values that make this nation strong." His words hit like a thunderclap. The protesters, who had been so consumed by their anger only moments before, now found themselves questioning everything. Trump wasn't merely defending an individual officer, he was challenging the very foundation of the anger that had brought them here. He wasn't making a political statement. He wasn't endorsing any particular ideology. He was appealing to something deeper, something more human, the call for justice, unity, and equality. His words were not just a defense of Officer Roberts, they were a reminder that the ideals of justice, fairness, and respect for all were supposed to define this nation. The shift in the crowd was immediate. The voices that had once been raised in rage fell into a stunned silence. The protesters, many of whom had been filled with so much hatred just moments before, now began to look inward. Some lowered their signs, their faces twisting with shame as they reflected on the anger they had been carrying. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to reconcile their feelings with what they had just heard. The profound weight of Trump's message had forced them to confront their own biases, their own prejudices, and the truth they had been unwilling to face. For Officer Roberts, it was as if the world had suddenly slowed, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the man he had come to expect. The divisive, often inflammatory figure portrayed in the media. This wasn't just a politician delivering a speech. No, in this moment, Donald Trump had become something else. He had become an unexpected ally in a battle against racial injustice. His words were more than political rhetoric. They were a rallying cry for the principles that this nation claimed to stand for. They were a message of solidarity, a reminder that racism and hate had no place in their society. The moment of silence that followed was profound. The protesters stood in shock, the energy that had been so fierce now dissipating. It was as though the spell of anger that had gripped them had been broken. Trump's intervention had sparked something deeper within them, an awareness, a moment of introspection. As the silence stretched on, Trump turned back to Officer Roberts. Without hesitation, he extended his hand, his eyes meeting Roberts, with a look of genuine respect. The handshake wasn't just an exchange of hands, it was a symbolic gesture, a moment of solidarity between two men who, on the surface, seemed to be worlds apart. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Trump had shown up not as a politician, not as a figurehead, but as an ally, standing firm in the face of racial injustice. His words, his actions, had made a powerful statement. Racism and hatred had no place in this society, and anyone who stood for justice and equality would not be left to fight alone. "You're doing great work," Trump said, his voice quieter now, softer. It was a far cry from the brash tone he had often used in public speeches. There was something personal, something human in his words, a reminder that this wasn't just about politics. It was about people, about human dignity, and about the belief that no one should have to endure hate, especially because of the color of their skin. For Officer Roberts, those words were more than just a compliment. They were a balm to his battered spirit, a reminder that, despite the cruelty and hatred he had faced, there were still people who saw him for who he truly was, a man doing his job, doing it well, and doing it with honor. As the crowd began to disperse, some protesters walking away with their heads lowered, others lost in thought, Officer Roberts felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The sting of the racial slurs, though still painful, no longer felt as sharp. The cruelty of the moment had not disappeared, but the support he had just received, unexpected, unwavering, had reminded him that he was not alone. For the first time in what had felt like an eternity, he began to feel hope again. He was part of something larger than this moment, something larger than the anger of the crowd or the hatred that had been thrown his way. And as the street returned to its normal rhythm, Roberts walked away from the protest with a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for justice and equality was far from over. But in this moment, something had shifted. The deep divisions that had torn this country apart had not been healed in an instant, but in that one powerful, unexpected act of solidarity, Officer Roberts had been given a glimpse of what might be possible.